Good evening, everyone. I'm Dave Eldon. With me is Dalton Grimes, and we've got a special treat for everyone today here.
Indeed we do. So, we've got some corrections.
No.
But
Not corrections. We didn't get anything wrong.
But
Wizards
we didn't
changed
get
what the
anything
right
wrong.
answers was.
Yes.
Changed what the right answers was. So we're going to be talking about triggered abilities today. The biggest change by far that we've seen, and it's a lot of stuff. So we're not going to do a whole lot of joking around like we usually do. Sorry for everybody who likes joking around, but it is kind of a big topic. So we're gonna have to kind of like talk about a lot of stuff here.
And yeah, I would say that the majority, or at least the plurality of calls I get at events revolve around mistriggers.
Yeah, I would
And
say
so
it's probably the most.
Knowing these is definitely one of the greatest things you can do for yourself.
Oh, yeah.
And so we will be discussing this in terms of competitive REL.
Yep.
As far as I remember, nothing changed for the jar.
No.
As far as mistriggers are.
Not really.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff changed in the jar other than like the bribery and wagering kind of stuff.
Yes.
But
So treat those as you normally would, which is pretty much how we've always done it.
Yeah.
So we're going to be focusing on the competitive aspect of this.
Yeah, and triggered abilities is like a really big topic. So I thought what we would do is instead of making you watch like our old triggered abilities video and then making you watch this one, we're going to go over everything right now the way it is in Magic the Gathering. So we're going to talk about how Mist Triggers works right now, and we're going to do that for probably about the next hour, and it's going to be awesome. And I love talking about triggered abilities. I could probably talk about it for 2 hours if you wanted to.
Let's not make them suffer.
Oh, come on. You're no fun. Okay. So, step one. What is a triggered ability? Triggered ability is at, when, or whenever. If you take a look at a Magic card and you see one of those words, that's how you would know it would be a triggered ability. So, like, here's an example. For example, this is Soul Warden. Soul Warden says, whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life. So this would be an example of a triggered ability. You all know that. If you watched any of our other triggered ability-ish videos, which has been like quite a few, to be honest. Really.
And as a reminder, the whenever at does not need to come at the start of the sentence.
Oh yeah, believe me, we'll be talking about a couple of different formats that you might see this presented in.
Yep.
So
that one caused me quite a few issues when I first started judging.
Yeah,
so
it can be anywhere
always look out for those 3 words, and if you missed it, then thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. See, you get it.
If you missed it, then you might be dealing with a mistrigger.
Yeah. So the way that the IPG is set up, and again, we're just going to be going like straight through the IPG and like talking about the sections as they come up here. The way the IPG is set up for mistrigger is that they spend a bunch of time first talking about what constitutes a mistrigger, as in like at what point does the game consider the triggered ability to be missed, and after that it talks about what you should do. So we're going to be doing the same sort of thing. We're going to talk about first what conditions need to happen in order for a triggered ability to be considered a missed trigger. So the first thing that we want to talk about is the infraction's name is missed trigger. It is not forgotten trigger, and that's a very important distinction because that means that somebody can forget about a trigger and later on they can remember it and point it out, and it doesn't count as a missed trigger until a very specific time in the game. And the CR talks about like what a triggered ability is and when it's supposed to trigger, but players don't always acknowledge that stuff at the time when the CR says they should. So the IPG has a list of things that say, okay, this type of trigger, you have to announce it at this time. This type of trigger, you have to announce it at this time. So we're going to go through that list right through and with some examples, because we know this IPG stuff can get a little bit dry at times. So we're going to spice her up a little bit here.
Yeah, it's like when you go back to school and you're like, oh man, these books have pictures in them.
Yeah.
That's exactly what this is.
Yeah.
So there are 4 specific scenarios where a triggered ability must be either announced or acknowledged.
Yeah, they break all the triggered abilities into these 4 categories.
Yep. So the point by which a player needs to demonstrate awareness, There are 4 of them. The first is that a trigger ability that requires its controller to choose targets other than target opponent in a 1-player game, or modes or other choices made when it's on the stack. So if something were to trigger that required a target, a mode, or a choice, and the player acknowledged none of those things, then we have a pretty good sign that this trigger may have been missed.
Yeah, so first of all, what would be an example of such a triggered ability?
Well,
This is the one that we used
I'm going
the last
to use
time.
my psychic powers.
This is the
and
one we
say
used the last
magnetic
time
force.
that we were talking about. So the last miss trigger show that we did, we talked about magnetic force, and this hasn't changed at all, right? So at the beginning of each upkeep, magnetic force deals 3 damage to any target. So you notice that you have to choose a target for this triggered ability. Modal triggered abilities would be the same thing. Any triggered ability that requires any type of choice as part of the process of putting that triggered ability on the stack. So modes and targets, of course, would be the most common manifestations of that sort of a thing. And so as a result, these types of triggered abilities, you have to, the deadline for when you have to declare or announce your awareness of it is before the next priority pass. In other words, you have to say that the triggered ability happened before the next time someone would be able to add something else to the stack on top of it. And that makes sense, right? Because if you go past that point, then the game state is not correct, because there would be a thing on the stack with choices that would have needed to be made for it to go on the stack, but those choices haven't been made yet. So that's the reason why that's the case. What's our next category of triggered abilities, Dalton?
Yeah. So another category of triggered abilities are triggered abilities that cause a change in the visible game state, which could include things like changes to life totals, or that require a choice upon resolution.
Right.
So in order for these to be considered remembered, or rather the
Not
lack of
missed.
this to be missed, the controller must take the appropriate physical action or acknowledge the specific trigger before taking any further game actions that can be taken only after that has resolved. So for example...
Yeah, so here's an example of a triggered ability that's talking about. So remember that we're talking about triggered abilities that cause a change in the visible game state. In this case, the change in the visible game state is when Dragon Mantle enters the battlefield, draw a card. So obviously, me drawing a card would increase the number of cards in my hand, which would of course be a change in the visible game state. Everybody can see that change. The one that we had earlier at the beginning of the show, the Soul Warden, that would be another example of this sort of a triggered ability. Gaining 1 life is specifically called out in the IPG here as a change in the visible game state. And so the controller of these triggered abilities has to acknowledge that. So here's some important language. We're going to break this down here. They have to take the appropriate physical action or acknowledge the specific trigger before taking any game actions that can only happen after the trigger should resolve. So what does this mean? Well, there's a lot to unpack in this statement here. So let's take a look at it kind of phrase by phrase. So in order to be considered remembered, you can't just say trigger when something happens. So you have to say what you're going to do, or say what the source of that trigger is, so that people know that you aren't just saying trigger every time something happens in the game to get out of having to actually remember your triggered abilities. So that's the reason why that's there. So for Dragon Mantle, you would have to say draw a card, or make it clear. Now if you play a Dragon Mantle and then say trigger, and like while your hand is still on the Dragon Mantle, I think that would probably count for me as a judge that they were remembering or acknowledging that triggered ability rather than some other one. But if they had, for example, one of those Enchantress cards, it's like whenever you play an enchantment card or an enchantment spell, draw a card, then the bar for me would be a little bit higher. I would want to see that they either specifically reference their Enchantress creature in some way by like vocally saying its name or pointing to that card, or else say that they're drawing a card specifically for that reason. So, okay, that is the controller must take the appropriate physical action or acknowledge the specific trigger before taking any game actions that can only be taken after the triggered ability should have resolved. So let's take another look at this dragon mantle here. So for this is our like kind of toy example, right? So let's say we have the dragon mantle, and I'm gonna play dragon mantle.
Sure.
Right, and I'm gonna play it on my grizzly bear. Dalton is going to do some stuff. He says he doesn't care about any of this. So he's like, okay, sure, dragon mantle resolves. And then I say, okay, now I'm going to lightning bolt your other creature, Dalton, and then I'll jam. Oh, by the way, I get to draw a card.
Yeah.
Okay, do I get to draw a card? Is this a missed trigger?
Yeah, so in this scenario, because lightning bolt is an instant, the fact that David is choosing to cast a lightning bolt is something that could be done in response to this trigger.
Yes.
We clarified with David that when we acknowledge Dragon Mantle, we acknowledge that Dragon Mantle resolved.
Yes.
And then after doing so, David casts an instant.
Okay.
So because of that, that could be in response to the trigger. Even though he didn't acknowledge it prior, it's still not missed.
Right.
It could have been clearer.
Now, the other thing that I said was, and then I'm going to attack. Right? So that's a problem. Okay? So lightning bolting your creature is not a problem because of exactly what Dalton said, right? It's legal for me to play Dragon Mantle, put the draw card trigger on the stack, respond to that trigger by playing lightning bolt, and then, proceed and then draw the card with so that's legal. What is not legal is for me to declare attackers while the draw card trigger is still on the stack, because that would mean that we have moved from the main phase where I play the Dragon Mantle to the combat phase, which is where you get to declare your attackers, and that's a no-go, and you are not able to proceed from the main phase to the combat phase with triggered abilities on the stack.
I totally missed that you said go to combat.
Yeah. So I kind of snuck that in, and I kind of did a little subtly because I wanted to make sure. Back when we originally did this, I did not have that extra wrinkle in there. I put that in for later. So sneaky. Sneaky. So yeah, that is the maybe meaning of that fleshed out a little bit more. So passing priority, casting an instant spell, activating an ability, those are all things that don't necessarily mean that a triggered ability has been forgotten. It can still be on the stack when all that stuff takes place, but explicitly taking an action such as casting a sorcery spell or explicitly taking an action in the next step or phase such as declaring attackers, those would be examples of things that could not happen with those triggered abilities on the stack. So those would be things that would cause those triggered abilities to be missed. All right, so next one on down the list.
Our third category of triggered abilities are triggered abilities that change the rules of the game.
Okay, so what's your favorite example of this?
My favorite?
Do you remember what we used the last time?
No, I don't. I remember the one that caused problems most recently.
Which one was that?
Bloodstone Goblin.
Okay, so Xantid Swarm was actually the one that we used the last time, but you're right. Bloodstone Goblin was the one that we used. Bloodstone Goblin was the one that I prepared to talk about in this case. So yes, this is exactly right.
So in order for these triggers not to be missed, the controller of the trigger has to stop anyone who is trying to take an illegal action as a result of these rules changing.
Right. So in this case, we've got like the Bloodstone Goblin, right? And the +1/+1 isn't important for this, but the Gaining Menace is, right? The Gaining Menace is where it changes the rules of the game because now we can't be blocked except by 2 or more creatures. So what would you say would be an interesting example here, Dalton?
Yeah, so
this actually happened to you, didn't it?
It did not happen to me.
It wasn't to you, it was some other judge that you know.
Yes, so player in their first main phase kicks a spell, says trigger. So they're acknowledging Bloodstone Goblin. Or sorry, they do not say trigger.
Yeah, they don't acknowledge it.
They cast the spell, and they go to combat. They attack with just the Bloodstone Goblin. The opponent blocks with a 3/3 creature, and then the player with the Bloodstone Goblin says, okay, they'll trade, and the opponent goes, no, that's a 2/2. Well, player A said that because his creature got +1/+1, he didn't need to acknowledge that, which is true. Because it doesn't.
We'll wait till later to talk about why that's the case.
However, because the triggered ability also gives it menace, that changes how the rules of the game work. That changes how it can be blocked.
Yeah.
And because he allowed his opponent, I'm assuming he's in this case, to block with a 3/3 creature, a single 3/3 creature, the judges ruled that the trigger was in fact missed, and that the creature was a bad attack.
Yep, and so here it is. This is the triggered ability that changes the rule of the game. And so the IPG says the controller has to acknowledge a trigger or stop an opponent who tries to take a resulting illegal action. And so like Dalton said, it was not legal to block with only one creature. So the point at which this player would have needed to acknowledge this trigger is not when the damage gets dealt, but actually when the blocking happens, because blocking with only one creature is not a legal thing. And notice that this is one triggered ability that includes both of these effects, which means that whatever the earliest one to happen, that's the one that you have to go by in order to make it be missed or not missed. So the fourth one is a triggered ability that affects the game state in non-visible ways. And so that would be an example of if it was just a triggered ability that said it gets +1/+1. So is there any triggered abilities like that in Modern or any other formats?
I was going to say Prowess, but Exalted's a pretty good one.
We don't play these clown red decks that is like we only play honest, fair decks that try to do 10 damage to people.
Blue has Prowess.
Yeah, it's sort of. I don't think there's any playable ones that aren't red.
So, Exalted is a good example of this. Whenever a creature you control attacks alone, that creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn.
Yeah.
Does this change the power and toughness of the creature? Yes, it does.
Sure does.
Does it change the power and toughness of the creature in a visible way?
Yeah.
No. So the fact that this ability can trigger without a player explicitly mentioning it can cause some issues. And so in order for this trigger not to be considered missed, the player has to acknowledge it at the first time in which it would have a visible impact on the game state.
Yeah.
For example, when damage is dealt.
Yeah,
or
that's when the 1/2-ness of Noble Hierarch is going to actually change something that someone can see. So for example, life total or damage on a creature that would cause it, for example, to die or not die.
Yeah, so with our previous example of the Bloodstone Goblin, that +1/+1 isn't something that would have had to have been announced.
Yeah.
If Bloodstone got +1/+1 whenever you kicked a creature spell and they attacked and those creatures traded, that would have been perfectly fine. And everything
or if he was on
great.
blocks, or if he was blocking with Bloodstone Goblin, that's also another possibility.
However, because it also gained menace and changed the rules, that one works differently.
Yep, it gets pushed into that third category instead of this fourth one. So what's an example of something that does change the power and toughness of a creature in a visible way? It's not just it's not possible, or it is possible for that to happen. And here's an example. So this one puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control as a triggered ability. This is not a visible, or this is a visible change to the game state. So it would fit under the triggered ability that causes a visible change in the game state. The second bucket. You would need to point this one out before moving on past the point in the game where the triggered ability could potentially still be on the stack. And so that is a similar-ish kind of effect, but it's completely different as far as the IPG is concerned. It's
similar but completely different.
It's a different. So yeah, make sure you're paying attention. Like I said, these are the untrained eye. Maybe we should be handling these exactly the same, but no.
Yes,
there is a distinction.
So because it is a counter, counters are considered a known thing. They're not.
Yeah, it's public information what counters are on an object. So therefore, it's not possible to say that, hey, I remembered it. Look, they're invisible or something. That's not how it works.
Yep.
Okay, so here's some more stuff. Ooh boy. So that's the 4 buckets that they fit into. Does anybody have any questions or any interesting stuff that they wanna talk about here with these triggered abilities. Hi to Fuzzy Thanatos.
Yeah. So all 4 of those things stayed the same.
Yeah. Nothing about this is different. The different stuff is going to come up later. Don't worry. We have lots of different stuff that we can talk about.
And there is.
Oh yeah.
Yes, there is.
Oh yeah. It's like, okay. So let's talk about some of this stuff. Okay. This is okay. Let's go through. I guess we have to go through a little bit more stuff before we get to the really different stuff. But that's fine. We prepared all kinds of examples for this kind of stuff. So once any of those obligations have been fulfilled, further problems are treated as a gameplay error, game rule violation. So for example, let's go back to our Bloodstone Goblin for this example. With a Bloodstone Goblin play, let's say that the player kicks a spell. And then he says, okay, my Bloodstone Goblin gets buffed. And then he attacks with Bloodstone Goblin. And opponent only blocks with 1 creature. And then we go to damage, and he's like, yeah, your 1 creature should die. Because my Bloodstone Goblin's at 3/3. Right?
Yep.
So, because the player did his due diligence in announcing this trigger, he met the obligations that were set forth in those 4 categories, that means we're good. We remembered the triggered ability happened. But the problem now is that he still let the person block with only 1 creature, even though Bloodstone Goblin has Menace. So that is the problem now, and that would be a game rule violation. It would be for my view, it would probably be a game rule violation for both the players, given that Bloodstone Goblin player's card had an effect that was neglected, and the opponent personally took a hand in that by illegally blocking the thing that had Menace.
And also talk to the opponent in that case. Because if they realized it had Menace and they still blocked with 1 creature...
Well, you still investigate for
That's a big problem.
Cheating is still a thing.
But in this case, even though the first player only said, Bloodstone Goblin will get buffed, it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, no, I mean, like that,
in my opinion, that they acknowledge this trigger.
Yeah, once again, the controller must take the appropriate physical action. Oh, this would be for a visible game state. So for a triggered ability that changes the rules of the game, the player must acknowledge the trigger, which they did, or stop an opponent, which they did not. So they did acknowledge the trigger. They did satisfy what it said in the IPG. So they're in the clear for as far as that triggered ability being remembered.
Yep.
So yeah, once that happens, further problems are treated as a game rule violation, and that would mean like a backup or a partial fix or leave the game state as is, as appropriate. Refer to our other materials on game rule violations for more information.
Yeah, so moving forward, certain triggered abilities do nothing but create delayed triggered abilities.
You got any examples of that off the top of your head?
Oh, Prized Amalgam.
Oh, you did. Good job. That's actually the one that the one that I independently came up with for this one. So
so this dumb card has 2 triggered abilities, and the first one, all it does is create the second. So with Prized Amalgam, whenever a creature enters the battlefield from the graveyard, you create the second trigger for Prized Amalgam, which is return it to from the graveyard to your battlefield tapped at the beginning of the next end step.
Yep.
So in a case like this, that first trigger to create the second is always considered remembered.
Yeah, you always remember it. You don't even have to say anything. Another card that had this kind of thing would be the God's Cycle from the Hour of Devastation set. So whenever the Locust God dies, return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So again, the dying of Locust God is always going to get remembered. The thing that might be forgotten or might not be forgotten is the return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So that is how those triggers work.
Yep, and like I mentioned earlier, triggers, just because that is one chunk of text does not make it one trigger ability.
It's actually 2, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, for the Locust God, it says when it dies, return it to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. Or sorry, return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step.
Yeah, the Prized Amalgam was that. Yeah. So okay, that second triggered ability still has to be remembered based on the 4 categories that we talked about earlier. So depending on what type of thing that triggered ability does, you might have to, at different points in the game. But you don't get that one for free. You only get the first one that creates the second one for free.
Yep.
So, okay, triggered abilities that do nothing...
Which is a change.
No, that was always the same, but like the way that you fix it got changed.
Yes. That did.
Yeah, you always get the first triggered ability for free. That was not a change.
Nope.
But the way you handle fixing it definitely did.
Yep.
So we'll talk about that at the appropriate point in the IPG though. Triggered abilities that do nothing except create one or more copies of a spell, such as Storm, automatically resolve, but awareness of the resulting objects on the stack has to be demonstrated based on the 4 criterias.
Which I don't think I've ever seen a card with Storm not be remembered.
Yeah, the Storm trigger is pretty important to remember. The Cipher one isn't, though.
Yes.
If you like attack with the Cipher thing, you definitely could be attacking for a different reason than you wanted your Cipher spell. And so that one you could, I could see that one happening a little bit more relevantly. But so that's kind of interesting. Nothing too interesting to see there.
Yep.
So let's move on to the next category here.
Yep. A new format of triggered abilities, referred to as reflexive abilities, arrived in Amonkhet, and with it came new issues. So whenever we have abilities that have an action followed by the words "when you do," these triggers are considered acknowledged by communicating the action. So, for example, with Exert, for example, Bitterblade Warrior...
This is a good example of the card.
You may exert it...
I had to look for this one because there's a bunch of Exert ones that are kind of don't fit in really good to this is a great example, and we'll talk about why.
Yep, so you exert it as you attack.
Yeah.
Or you may.
Yeah.
And if you say, I'm going to attack with Bitterblade Warrior, I'll exert it, you are automatically considered to be acknowledging the +1/+0 and Death Touch until end of turn.
Yes.
So, because of that, if a player says that they will exert Bitterblade Warrior and then does not give it +1/+0 and Death Touch until end of turn, that becomes a game rule violation as opposed to a missed trigger, because by exerting it, you have already acknowledged the trigger.
Yeah, so this is important because if you didn't have this part of the IPG, what could happen is I'll attack with Bitterblade Warrior, exert, opponent's like, okay, that's fine, I'll block with my 1/3, and then okay, let's go to damage. Okay, my 1/3 lives due to the fact that you did not acknowledge the triggered ability that happens when you exert Bitterblade Warrior. You only said that you were exerting it, but you didn't say that and that's real. That definitely would happen if we didn't have this sentence in the IPG that says that that's dumb and don't be a jerk.
Yep, Amonkhet now are rotated out of Standard, but right now in Standard we do have Dream Eater, which comes up every now and then.
Yeah, the Dream Eater.
Yep, so with Dream Eater, if you surveil the 4, you are automatically considered to have remembered the returning target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. However, that one chooses a target.
Yeah, and that's the reason why I was so patting myself on the back with the exert ones. The Bitterblade Warrior does not require a target. This one does require a target, which means that when you in order to not have this triggered ability get forgotten or missed, you have to actually say a target, because this is the first category of triggered abilities, the kind that require a choice when the ability is put on the stack. You cannot progress past that point in the game without making those choices, or else the triggered ability will be considered missed.
Yep.
So, okay, that's good. That's really excellent. Let's see here. This next one is kind of interesting. If a triggered ability would have no impact on the game, it's not an infraction to fail to demonstrate awareness of it. And so I'm going to show you guys the card that caused this sentence to be put into the IPG. It was one specific card that caused it, and that card is Desecration Demon. So notice the triggered ability at the beginning of each combat. Any opponent may sacrifice a creature. So this is a triggered ability, of course, and it triggers each combat, and you have to announce it each combat, because it is a triggered ability that can happen.
Yep.
And let's say that your opponent had no creatures, so there really isn't any reason for you to have to announce that trigger. But, there is a really important thing, which is that if you don't announce a triggered ability, then that's a missed trigger. And that could be a penalty. And if you get 3 penalties of that type in one tournament, then maybe that penalty gets upgraded to a game loss. And there were absolutely people who got missed triggers that were upgraded to game losses with this card because they did not say, "Would you like to sacrifice a creature, sir?" even though you have none. And so...
Which in and of itself feels
rude. It was super scummy. It was super scummy,
no, I meant asking your opponent with 0 creatures.
Yeah.
Like,
hey, buddy,
hey.
You want to take 6, or you got any creatures to sacrifice? But like that's how it was. If you didn't say that every single time, then your opponent might call for a judge, and you might get a penalty, and that penalty might be a game loss, because that was how the rules work. So then they added this sentence in.
I wanted to cast Raise the Alarm in response.
Well, I mean, like that's fine. If you don't have any creatures, then you might want to remember their triggered ability for them, because they are not forced to remember that triggered ability if you have no creatures.
Yeah, so just because the opponent may have mana up and might have the potential to do something, it doesn't have a impact on the game state as is, so you will only treat that game state as it is. You can't give information out that the opponent might know just because there's a potential play.
Yeah, and the next sentence is also something that one specific card caused to get put into the IPG. So this says, similarly, a player demonstrating awareness of an optional trigger with no visible effect is assumed to have made the affirmative choice unless the opponent responds. So with that, the card in question is Eldrazi Mimic. So this is, of course, a triggered ability that has an option. The option in this case is you may change Eldrazi Mimic's base power and toughness to that creature's power and toughness until end of turn. And so we are assuming that if somebody plays a Reality Smasher and they have an Eldrazi Mimic in play, and then they point to the Eldrazi Mimic and say, trigger, that they are, not just remembering the fact that a triggered ability has been put onto the stack, but also choosing to, make my thing a 5/5 rather than not. Because otherwise what could happen is Reality Smasher, trigger on Eldrazi Mimic, jam with my creatures, and then they're like, okay, I will take 7 because I thought that you were, choosing no with the Eldrazi Mimic. It was kind of ambiguous there. So that specific example is what caused this sentence to be put on. So, of course, if the opponent responds, you're not held to that choice. So if they dismember the Reality Smasher in response, then you're not forced to make your Eldrazi Mimic a 0/0. So that is the example that we cooked up, and that's probably still the most relevant example of that rule. So there you go.
And so as judges, it is not our responsibility to intervene in the case of a mistrigger situation. However, we are encouraged to do so if we intend to issue a warning or have a reason to suspect that the controller might have intentionally missed the trigger.
Right. So to clarify that, if someone misses a trigger, happens all the time. But it's not a missed trigger that you would give a warning to. If it's not a missed trigger you would give a warning to, then you don't need to point that triggered ability out. And so that is an important thing to note, because we will have an example for that. We'll just talk about that one now, because it does fit pretty well in. This is a real story from a real tournament that really happened, and it could happen to you too. So okay, here's a card that I like to call. We'll talk about this one later. Should we talk about it later or now?
Let's do it now.
Okay, so we've got this. Well, it's interesting because it fits into a couple of different ways. So this is Thing in the Ice. Thing in the Ice. Maybe if you play Modern, you've seen these newfangled decks that have the Thing in the Ices in them, and the Phoenixes. All the cool kids are running them. So you notice that Thing in the Ice has a triggered ability. When you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you remove an ice counter from it. Then if it has no ice counters on it, transform.
Sure.
And this is what it transforms into. It transforms into another card called Awoken Horror.
Pretty cool.
this also has a triggered ability. When it transforms into Awoken Horror, return all non-horror creatures to their owner's hands. So, let's say that I have a thing in the ice that has one thing in the ice counter on it.
Sure.
And my spell that I'm going to play is our old friend Lightning Bolt. So I'm going to play a Lightning Bolt targeting your 2/2. Okay?
Okay.
So Dalton puts his 2/2 in the graveyard, and I flip the thing in the ice over. Cool. Do you see any problems with that, Dalton?
Yeah. So when I go to put the creature in the graveyard, that implies that we have passed through the point where the thing in the ice should have triggered.
Yeah. So
the thing in the ice is
let's go through it step by step so that people can see exactly what happens in this scenario, because it does come up quite a bit.
Yep. So theoretically, the way this should work out is David casts Lightning Bolt, announces his trigger. The trigger will go on the stack above the Lightning Bolt. The triggered ability will resolve, which will then
Flip thing in the ice.
That will trigger, which still goes above Lightning Bolt, and returns all non-horror creatures, including my 2/2, to their owner's hands.
Right.
That will resolve. My 2/2 should go to hand, and then Lightning Bolt, no longer with a legal target, is removed from the stack.
Right.
So is how it should work.
That's the correct way to go through this. But in our situation, Dalton put his thing in the graveyard. So
no, the thing's in the ice.
Dalton put his 2/2 in the graveyard. And so if you are a judge and you watch this happen, what should you do?
Panic. Always panic.
It's an interesting question, because what is the answer normally? The triggered ability from Awoken Horror was missed, maybe.
Possibly.
Well, it definitely was, because the players both proceeded in the game as though the triggered ability has not happened. So the players missed the trigger, and this is in so it is a missed trigger. But this sentence in the IPG says that judges should not intervene unless they're going to assess a penalty. We'll give you a spoiler. Triggered ability, missed trigger is not a infraction that you give a penalty for unless the triggered ability is normally considered detrimental to the player who controls the triggered ability.
Yep.
That's like the short version. We'll talk in more detail later. Yep. But so this is a problem, because with Awoken Horror's return all stuff to your owner's hands, this is generally not something that is detrimental for the Awoken Horror player. It's generally a benefit to return your opponent's creatures to their owner's hands.
Yep.
And so as a result of that, this does not fit that criteria. Now, the judge may well have reason to suspect that the controller is intentionally missing their triggered ability, given that this triggered ability is, obviously if I was a Awoken Horror player, I would rather have my opponent's creature in the graveyard rather than in their hand. So you might intervene in that case if you have a reason to suspect that the player intentionally missed their triggered abilities. But the way that this question originally came up, it was actually a little bit more obscure. There was it was a more complicated version of this example. So I was pretty confident that neither player had intentionally forgotten about this. It was just that they both so correctly.
Yep.
I did not intervene, although I almost did. I had to. I started walking over there, and then I remembered this sentence. I was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Shouldn't be giving a penalty here. Pretty sure the player didn't intentionally forget this trigger. So yeah, it's no intervention.
Yeah, and just hanging out in the area there is probably a good idea.
For sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
Don't be obvious and walk up and hover over the players. But if you see it and you're just kind of in the area and you hear, oh, that should have gone to your hand, now you might want to step in and explain what's happening.
Yep. Okay, and the last one before we get to the philosophy, a player who controls another player is responsible for that player's triggers in addition to their own. So this would be relevant, for example, with a card like Mindslaver. If I am controlling Dalton's turn, Dalton during his turn, then that means that I bear responsibility for remembering triggered abilities that result from Dalton's cards. So that's pretty simple, but it's important to have that in there so that people Because that's a question I've definitely been asked in a real tournament. Is like, can I forget my opponent's trigger with this, because I'm controlling their turn? And of course, the answer to that would be no. So, all right, moving on to the philosophy. First, does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff that we talked about here? This is some real solid gold triggered ability, recognizing stuff. But I understand that this is one of those things that's maybe lots of really small words, and they all are important to remember. So.
Yeah,
certainly not a problem to answer some questions in preparation to that.
The problem with Magic is that so many words sound similar.
Oh yeah,
and mean so many different things.
For sure. Okay, so let's move on to the philosophy part then. Triggered abilities are common and invisible. Players should not be harshly penalized for forgetting about one, but they are expected to remember their own triggered abilities. Intentionally ignoring one's could be cheating. We already know about that. Even if the opponent is involved in the announcement or resolution of the ability, the controller is still responsible for ensuring that the opponents make the appropriate choices and take the appropriate actions. So, like for example, a good example of that would be. So, all right. So, like one thing would be, for example, if there's a card like this. Right. So with Howling Mine, that would be an example of something that Dalton is responsible for doing the action, drawing a card during his turn, right? So even though this would be a case of, even though Dalton is involved in the resolution of that ability, I, the controller of Howling Mine, I'm still responsible for ensuring that Dalton makes the appropriate choices or takes the appropriate action. So I am responsible for making sure that Dalton remembers to draw his extra card. Opponents are not required to point out triggered abilities that they do not control, though they may do so if they wish. And we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of the episode when we have a specific example point picked out for that.
Yep. So, as we already talked about, triggered abilities are assumed to be remembered unless otherwise indicated, and the impact on the game state may not be immediately apparent. The opponent's benefit is in not having to point out triggered abilities, although this does not mean that they can cause triggers to be missed.
Yeah, so I can't say something like, I can't, if Dalton has something that says at the beginning of each step, or at the beginning of each upkeep, 3 damage to any target, like for example our old friend Magnetic Force here. So like if Dalton has this, I can't untap and then draw my card and be like, haha, we're in the draw step now, sucker. You can't do it. So I can't force Dalton to miss his trigger by doing that sort of thing. He has to be able to have that. If he does remember it.
And so if an opponent requires information about the precise timing of a triggered ability or needs details about a game object that may be affected by the resolved triggered ability, they may need to acknowledge its existence before the controller does.
So this is the canonical example of that sentence here.
Yeah. So essentially, some things may occur. For example, when you cast Demigod, return all cards named Demigod of Revenge from your graveyard to the battlefield.
Right.
So if I cast Demigod of Revenge, and my opponent might want to respond with something like a counterspell or a surgical extraction or something.
The counterspell is the important one in this example.
They might need to acknowledge the triggered ability of Demigod before the counterspell.
Yeah. So if I have a counterspell, the correct time for me to play the counterspell is after Demigod of Revenge's triggered ability resolves. Because otherwise what will happen is if I counter Demigod before the triggered ability resolves, then the Demigod of Revenge is going to be put into the graveyard, and then the triggered ability is going to resolve and return to the battlefield. So obviously that's no bueno for me, the counterspell player. So I would have to proactively say, I'm going to counter it, but we're going to wait to play the counterspell until after this triggered ability resolves. So even though I'm not the controller of Demigod of Revenge, it is in my best interest to demonstrate awareness of this triggered ability before my opponent is forced to demonstrate awareness of the triggered ability. So that would be an example of where that line of the IPG would come into play.
Yeah, and obviously if a player is going to cast that, it's very likely that a player might say Demigod of Revenge, put it on the table, and then start moving, demigods from the graveyard to the battlefield. And as the opponent, you're totally in your rights to say, hey, I'm going to respond after the spell, or to the spell after the trigger or something. You don't have to stop them before their physical action.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, in this case, you wouldn't, right? Because, like, them putting the stuff from the graveyard onto the battlefield is what you want to have happen before. But if they have no demigods to return, then it's ambiguous whether the triggered ability is on the stack or not, and they don't have to say whether it is or not.
Yep.
So if you counter it without saying exactly when you're countering it, then they might very well be, well, hey, you know, the triggered ability is on the stack, so we're going to go ahead and perform that action now. So.
And then finally, a player who makes a play that may or may not be legal depending on whether a player's uncommunicated trigger has been remembered has not committed an infraction. Their player either succeeds, which confirms the trigger's been missed, or it's rewound. So back to our Bloodstone Goblin example, when they cast their spell that was kicked in the first main phase and didn't say anything, went to combat, and as soon as that opponent blocks with a 3/3, if they know that their opponent might remember the trigger and says, hey, you can't block that, this has menace, they don't get a penalty. Because their opponent never said anything, they are essentially testing the waters to see if the opponent remembered. Because, as we mentioned earlier, the first time that trigger would have to be demonstrated is when an illegal thing would have occurred, such as blocking with a single creature. So the player with the Bloodstone to Goblin doesn't get to raise their hand and say, oh, well, my opponent did this, give them a penalty, unless they mentioned previously in the game, this gets +1/+1 and has menace, or otherwise acknowledge that specific trigger.
Yeah, this is a card that kind of caused that debate to really get into people's attention. So if I play Emrakul and I don't say anything, and you go to your turn, and you know you don't have any stuff to untap, so we'll just draw for turn, because that's the first thing you do on your turn.
Yep.
Is that okay? What do we do? And so this was the a specific example that brought that. So I don't have to say that I'm taking an extra turn until I actually am physically, about to take that turn. Dalton does not have to assume that I remember that I get to take an extra turn.
Yep.
So it's perfectly within his rights to proceed as if he's taking his next turn until I say, whoa, we can't do that. And so this is how that situation has happened. It gets to be resolved. This is how we resolve that situation. So Dalton is allowed to draw the card because he doesn't have any untapping stuff, or if he has tapped stuff, the first thing he would do would be start untapping. And that play will either succeed, which confirms that I slept my extra turn trigger, or it gets rewound, and then the game proceeds from there. And we already talked about this a little bit. Players cannot cause triggered abilities controlled by the opponents to be missed by taking game actions or otherwise prematurely advancing the game. During an opponent's turn, if a triggered abilities controller demonstrates awareness of the trigger before they take an active role, such as taking an action or explicitly passing priority, the trigger is remembered. So this would be like, for example, if I have a magmatic force and Dalton goes to draw for his turn, then during Dalton's turn, my awareness of the trigger before I take an active role is all that's required. So even though after Dalton draws his card, is past the point where the magmatic force's triggered ability should have happened, the fact that I'm not in an active role until later on means that I don't have to lose that triggered ability because Dalton drew his card. Meanwhile, Dalton does not have to say, untap, upkeep, draw, and make it super obvious that there's a spot where he's waiting for me to remember my trigger. He doesn't have to go out of his way to let me remember the trigger. But at the same time, he can't cause me to miss my trigger while I'm doing everything that a normal Magic player playing normal Magic would do.
Yep. And so with this, we finally get to our additional remedies for missed triggers.
Yeah, so everything up until now has been talking about how do we decide whether triggered ability is missed or not, right? That's everything up until now. Now we're going to talk about what happens once we determine that a triggered ability has been missed. So before that, anyone has any questions in the chat about phase 1, which is what happens, how do we decide if a triggered ability is missed, go ahead and chat that to us. Otherwise, we'll talk about how do we fix it. Okay, and this is the part where all the big changes have happened. This is the part that's changed most recently, and so as before, there's some exceptions. The normal case would be well, actually, we'll talk about that in the normal course of this thing because they talk about the exceptions first. So we'll talk about the exceptional cases first, and then we'll talk about what the normal default would be, which is basically like if it isn't one of these exceptions, do this.
Sure. All right. So the first additional remedy we have is a very specific one.
Yeah.
And that is if a triggered abilities, is an enters the battlefield trigger of an aura that affects only the enchanted permanent and causes a visible change to that permanent. So we have already 4 limitations to this. Resolve the ability immediately.
So I brought this card up, Malfunction, because this is the card that caused this sentence to be put in the IPG. So this is, of course, an aura, and the triggered ability, when it enters the battlefield, tap enchanted permanent. So it affects that permanent, affects only that permanent, and causes a visible change to that permanent. If I play a Malfunction on your creature, and I don't specifically say tap your creature, again, you don't have to physically tap your creature because you are not forced to remember my triggered ability for me. But at the same time, it felt kind of dumb that I would have to specifically say, yeah, and Malfunction is on the battlefield, so now we're going to have a triggered ability. You know, obviously, the like tapping it is part of the same brain process for most people as the putting the Malfunction onto the battlefield. So it seemed really dumb to punish them by leaving the creature forever untapped when there was like a simple fix. And so that's what the simple fix is. In these types of cases, we resolve the triggered ability immediately. And this is true no matter how much time has passed. This is true no matter when or who notices it and brings it to the attention of a judge. But again, you do want to bear in mind, like, is there a specific reason why the player might be bringing this up now? Do I believe them when I say that they just now remembered it? If you think that they might have sat on the triggered ability in order to disguise the fact that their opponent's creature was going to get tapped and then brought it up to a judge, then you might want to talk to the Malfunction player.
Yep. I saw someone get completely wrecked by this during a Guilds Ravnica with Capture Sphere. Oh,
yeah, same type of thing.
So our second additional remedy is that if a triggered ability is a delayed trigger ability that undoes a zone change, including the creation of a token, and is caused by the spell or ability that created the delayed triggered ability, the opponent chooses whether to resolve the ability the next time a player would get priority, or when a player would get priority at the start of the next phase.
All right, so lots of stuff to unpack in that. We're going to go ahead and bring our... See, get it? He wasn't there, and now he's here. See, okay. All right, so this is the type of card that sentence was written
That
for.
was next level.
Obsidat to Ghost Council. So at the beginning of your end step, you may exile Obsidat. If you do, return it to the battlefield under its owner control at the beginning of your next upkeep. And so this would be an example of a delayed triggered ability that undoes a zone change. In this case, we're undoing the exile Obsidat part. Token creation is counted as a zone change for these purposes. So for example, your Geist of St. Traff token generation. Caused by the spell or ability that created the delayed triggered ability. So what do we do in this case? This would be the example would be if I have Obsidat and I exile it, but I forget to put it back into play. What happens? Yeah. And the answer is no matter when we, no matter how many turns ago this happened, no matter which player figures it out, the way we fix it is always the same, which is that the opponent of the Obsidat player has a choice of when Obsidat comes back. They can either choose to put it back into play right now, or resolve the triggered ability right now, or resolve the triggered ability at the beginning of the next phase. And the reason why they have that choice is because if I am in the combat step and my opponent's like, hey, wait, Obsidat, or I'm like, hey, wait, Obsidat, I might already have some attackers declared, and it wouldn't really be fair to give my opponent an ambush 5/5 in order to block with. So that's the reason why I had the choice. Maybe I'm not going to do it right now. Maybe I'll do it at the beginning of the next phase. And that can be a reverse benefit because, or there's another way that can be not beneficial, because if I'm Obsidat player and we notice this, like if I'm in the combat step and that's when I notice the Obsidat should have come back, my opponent's like, probably gonna put that one back into play during your main phase. Which is fine, and that's fair. And hey, you know what? If you wanted to attack with Obsidat this turn, maybe you should have remembered that trigger ability during your upkeep step. So
and so there could be some confusion with this one, because what the IPG reads is the opponent chooses whether to resolve the ability the next time a player would get priority, or when a player would get priority at the start of the next phase.
Yeah.
So that doesn't necessarily mean that we're returning Obsidat to the battlefield right now. We are resolving the ability.
Yeah. So, for example, if a Grafdigger's Cage, or no, Grafdigger's Cage probably wouldn't work for this one. Grafdigger's Cage would work for like a Graveyard one, though. But yeah, if there's something that says that it can't enter the battlefield, then, that is taken into effect. And so that would be an example of where that distinction would come into play. So, okay, for all other triggered abilities, if the ability was missed prior to the current phase in the previous turn, then instruct the players to continue playing. So this is an interesting one. This means that if I have a triggered ability that should happen during my upkeep, and Dalton has just drawn his card for the turn, if we're still in, Dalton, as long as we're still in Dalton's draw step, that's still the beginning phase. So that's still good. We're still within the time limit that I can remember it.
Good.
Well, I mean, it's good for me because I get to get the triggered ability. So we're still in there, but that is an important point. Anytime past Dalton's draw step is where the deadline for it's just missed forever is. And again, this would be triggered abilities that aren't of the two categories that we already talked about. If the triggered ability created an effect whose duration has already expired, instruct the players to continue playing. So this would be an example of that.
Yes, and quickly, just because you are past a turn cycle from a penalty being missed does not mean you don't give a penalty.
Yeah, you can still give penalties.
Yes.
They just won't give the triggered ability.
So if a player says, hey, I forgot to sacrifice this creature at the beginning of the next end step, but we're 2 turns later, that's still probably a detrimental trigger.
Very good point. Very good point.
Yes.
So here's an example of that next thing. Whenever a player plays a creature spell, it gets -1/-1 until end of turn.
A spell.
Yeah. Oh, any spell. So if I have a blind creeper and my opponent plays a spell, and then we move on to my opponent's turn, even though we caught it within the deadline, in other words, even if we catch it in a spot that is before the current phase that is when the triggered ability should have happened, the duration of -1/-1 until end of turn means that we're past that point. So this one has a shorter deadline that you need to be able to catch it in. We don't put the triggered ability on the stack now.
Yeah, and the end of turn does not refer to the new end of turn because we're in a new turn.
So that is the type of triggered ability that sentence is talking about. So if the triggered ability created an effect whose duration had already expired, then continue playing. So even if we caught it then, we still don't get the blind.
Yep. And with the last one, if the triggered ability isn't covered by the previous paragraph,
which is almost all triggered abilities and almost all missed triggers that you'll encounter in an actual tournament play,
then the opponent chooses whether the triggered ability is added to the stack.
Yes.
If it is, it's inserted at the appropriate place on the stack, if possible, or on the bottom. No player may make any choices involving objects that would not have been legal when the ability should have triggered.
So here's an example of what we mean by that. Is our old friend Stampeding Wildebeests, that classic draft uncommon, I guess.
Yeah.
So if I have a Stampeding Wildebeest and I forget this triggered ability, and then I play a green creature during my turn, I can't return that, because that would not have been a legal choice for me to return with Stampeding Wildebeest at the time when the triggered ability should have happened, which is during my upkeep, before I played the creature.
Yep. So that covers all of the remedies.
Yep, and now it's time for the
mistriggers.
penalty. So finally we get to give some penalties.
So as we've
out.
mentioned, mistriggers themselves come with no penalty.
Normal.
However, there's an upgrade path. So if the triggered ability is usually considered detrimental for the controlling player and they own the card responsible for the existence of the trigger, the penalty is a warning. The current game state is not a factor in determining this, though symmetrical abilities, such as Howling Mine, may be considered usually detrimental or not, depending on who's being affected.
All right, so we'll unpack that a little bit
Yes.
here for everybody. So the general you can tell this to all your friends, and it's probably going to be about right. Is if the triggered ability is detrimental for the person who controls that triggered ability, then they get a warning. Otherwise, no penalty. So here's some complications that can happen for that. So for example,
You don't say.
yeah, there's a couple. So for example, let's talk about we won't talk about that one yet. Let's first talk about the Howling Mine thing, right?
Yep.
So once again, Howling Mine reads as follows: at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws a card. So this is generally considered detrimental to me for Dalton to draw a card, my opponent. It is not generally detrimental to me for me to draw a card. So if I forget Howling Mine's triggered ability, remember I'm responsible for remembering it no matter whose turn it is and no matter who's drawing the card. If I don't fulfill those obligations, then I may or may not get a warning, depending on whether it's me that would have got to draw a card or Dalton, because it's not generally considered detrimental for me to draw a card, but it is generally considered detrimental for me to have Dalton draw a card. So that's like step one. That's one of the potential complications here. And then there's this other thing. If the triggered ability is usually considered detrimental for the controlling player and they own the card responsible. So here's a card that this came up a lot. Let's just say this came up a lot in formats where this card was legal. So if you notice this extremely expensive magic card has the ability all creatures have at the beginning of your upkeep sacrifice.
Destroy.
Yeah, it is I believe destroy in the Oracle text. This is the Master's Edition printing. But destroy this creature unless you pay one. Also generally detrimental. But I have a card that gives Dalton's creatures and mine this ability. So if Dalton forgets to pay one to keep his creatures around, then what happens? Does Dalton get a penalty?
Yeah, so previously I would have.
Yeah, which was real feel bad. Because Dalton's creature is the source of this ability as far as the game is concerned. And so Dalton's creature is controlled by Dalton, and it's bad for Dalton to have to pay one to keep his creature around. And so therefore Dalton gets a warning.
Yeah.
That was dumb. It was really big feel bads to tell your player that, hey, your opponent had this card that made your creature have an ability, so that means that you have to remember that ability, so you get a warning because you didn't remember that
So in this case, the Tabernacle now is an ability that is, or the Tabernacle in this case is a card that is owned by David, and even though it has an ability that affects my creatures, it is not a warning for me because the card is not owned by me.
Yeah, Dalton doesn't own the card responsible for the existence of the trigger. So therefore the penalty is not upgraded.
Yeah.
And the go ahead.
Oh, and so in this case, this can lead to some weird areas.
Sure can.
Where maybe I remember the trigger and I'm aware of its existence, but the card is not owned by me. So does that mean I have to point it out? Because technically it's my creature with the ability, right?
Yeah. So to make things perfectly clear, Dalton's still has to point out that his creature has these abilities. It's not legal for Dalton to intentionally not remember this triggered ability, even though it is legal for me to intentionally not remember Dalton's triggered abilities. But Dalton is still a person who's responsible for remembering these triggered abilities. If Dalton doesn't remember it and it was an honest mistake, as opposed to Dalton intentionally not bringing this up, then no penalty for Dalton. But it's still Dalton's responsibility to point it out, and he has a responsibility to make a good faith effort to do so.
So essentially, in this scenario, I am either getting a mistrigger no penalty, or I am getting disqualified for cheating.
Because he forgot.
In this scenario, I am never getting a warning for mistrigger.
Good. Very, very well put. Very well put. And so, yeah, that is all of the mistrigger policy as it currently stands. There may be some changes in the future, but we will be sure to keep everybody apprised of these. We do have one additional situation that I did want to talk about here, and it's a real spicy one. I liked this situation a lot.
A spicy meatball, if you will.
I mean, it's not really that spicy, but it is important. So, like, let's say I play a Summoner's Pact, and, then I get my creature, and then we go through Dalton's turn, and then we go to my turn, and I draw for the turn, and then Dalton is immediately, Judge,
Judge, I got him. He's got to die.
We got this sucker. So, what happens? Let's go through the basic case first. So Dalton, in my draw step, immediately raises his hand. He's like, Judge. Dave drew his card, and he slipped his pack trigger. Ha. What happens?
Yeah. So dissecting this, Summoner's Pact creates a triggered ability in the upkeep. Pay 2 and 2 green. If you don't, you lose the game.
Hey, I didn't pay 2 and 2 green.
Yeah,
that's a fact.
I have noticed that David did not pay 2 and 2 green. How do I know? Because David has proceeded to his draw step. He is no longer in the upkeep. Which means this isn't there. So this is, or was, considered a trigger with a default action.
Yeah, these, if you're reviewing this in the future, be glad that you don't have to worry about like how confusing it was, because as confusing as it just was when you watched this video just now, it used to be a lot worse. But now we'll just talk about how it is now, so we aren't going to confuse anybody.
Yes. So now in this case, David has missed his triggered ability.
Sure has.
And in this case, I, as the opponent, get the choice of, would I like to put this ability on the stack now, or would I like to allow it to pass? David is not going to lose the game.
Probably going to put it on the stack.
Chances are I'm probably going to make David pay 4 mana.
Yeah.
But
at least I have the chance to pay 4 mana now.
You do have the chance. If I were to, for example, wait until David tapped out.
Yeah, that would be a strategically interesting decision.
Then I would definitely want to put the trigger on the stack now when David doesn't have the mana to pay for this.
Yeah.
And make him lose.
So wait a minute. Let's do an investigation. Let's say that Dalton is like, the basic case is this: Dalton immediately calls for a judge and is like, Judge, Dave forgot his pack trigger. What happens? And the answer to that is Dave gets the pack trigger put on the stack. Probably Dalton can also be a super nice guy and say, whatever. We'll let that trigger be missed.
You're gonna win anyway.
And that's very possible, because a lot of the time you probably are not going to live too much longer after the pack result. But yeah, so the answer is Dalton's probably going to say put the trigger on the stack, and then I will have to pay 2 green or lose the game. So that's like the level 1 answer. Level 2 of this situation is a little bit more interesting, which is that Dalton waits until after I tap out to play a second Primeval Titan, and then he's like, "Hey, Judge, Primeval Titan on the stack. I have a judge question. I remember that Dave missed his trigger earlier, and so anything you'd like to say about that?" So you're a judge, of course, so you can do an investigation.
You bet I am.
Hey, Dalton, at what point did you notice that Dave slept his Summoner's Pact trigger?
Oh, I noticed it immediately.
Oh, well, why are you just bringing it up now after he tapped out for another Primeval Titan?
Because I want to win.
Oh, okay, interesting. So this is a thing that people can do. That is completely legal, no problem. And the reason for that is because, as we said earlier, you are not obligated to remember your opponent's triggered abilities.
But you can.
One consequence of that is that you cannot get cheating or failure to maintain game state or anything as a result of not remembering your opponent's triggered abilities. There is also nothing in policy to support that you're somehow locked in to this decision once you make it. So maybe I changed my mind after a while for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And that is completely within your rights to do. And so I can choose to not point it out, and then some stuff happens in the game later, and now I'll point it out, and hey, look, Dave can't tap the mana, so he loses the game.
Yeah, so like an example of that could be if David attacks me with a Goblin Guide and he forgets to announce his reveal trigger.
Yeah.
And then later in the turn, I cast a Serum Visions and I scry a land to the top.
So you probably would cast the Serum Visions like on your turn.
On my turn, yes.
Yeah.
Within
main
one phase cycle.
In your main phase one.
Yeah, and so I now know that I have a land on top.
Yep.
And maybe previously I didn't want to give David the information because maybe I knew it was on top and I knew it was a land and I didn't want him to know I had it. Well, now I know there's a land on top.
Or you didn't know that there was a land on top and you weren't sure whether you would get to draw a card for free or
Exactly.
not.
So now I know there's a land on top. I can say, hey, now,
Yeah, no problem.
Judge, I'd like to put this on the stack and reveal that land that I just scried to the top.
Yep.
That's totally cool. And just because I noticed it earlier and maybe I changed my mind doesn't make a difference.
Yeah. So a couple more complications with the Summoner's Pact question. Number one, it is not possible for me to tap lands that I've played since the Summoner's Pact trigger should have happened. So for example, if I play a land and then afterwards Dalton remembers the trigger for me, then puts it on the stack, I cannot tap the land that I just played because you're not allowed to make choices involving objects that were not on the battlefield in order to resolve these triggered abilities.
Well, David, you have a Sakura Tribe Scout. Can you activate it to put a land out?
Interesting question. Let's review the exact wordings here. So if the triggered ability isn't covered within the paragraphs, the opponent chooses whether that triggered ability is added to the stack. So because the triggered ability just gets added to the stack, you can respond to it just like normal, and you would be able to make that type of a play. So that's perfectly legit. One other kind of interesting complication is that Dalton can remember this trigger anytime up until his draw step. So after he draws his card for the turn, but before he goes to the main phase, then any time up until that point is when Dalton can remember the trigger and have it get added to the stack. So again, that corresponds to the time of the triggered ability being missed prior to the current phase in the previous turn. So up until Dalton's main phase, it still was missed in the current phase of the previous turn. So that is all of the stuff I wanted to talk about with that example.
Yeah.
Did you have any other interesting
We
stuff
went
that
a
you wanted?
little bit long, so
But it was worth
Thank
it,
you for
right?
sticking
It was
with
worth
us.
it because this is interesting stuff, right?
Yep.
I think so anyway. And this is important stuff for judges to be able to know and be able to do too. So I don't mind taking a little extra time to make sure we really go into good detail about all of this.
And one more small thing with the Tabernacle Pendrel Veil example.
Oh yeah.
If David has a Tabernacle and it's my turn, and I accidentally forget the ability, and we determine that I'm not cheating, I accidentally forgot it.
Yeah.
David owns the Tabernacle, but because it's my triggered ability, David will get to be the one to choose whether or not it goes on the stack.
Correct.
Just because his thing makes it doesn't automatically mean I get the choice.
Yeah, the person who is responsible for the triggered ability existence is only responsible, or is only important when you're deciding whether to issue a warning or not. So yep, that's good. That's all of the stuff that we were going to talk about. Thank you for being with us for this time, and we will see you next time. Signing out. Have a good evening, everyone.